The American dream often paints a picture of success, of a promising young future filled with potential. Colin Griffith seemed to fit that mold, a bright teenager, already earning college credits, with a proud mother who frequently shared his achievements online. From the outside, his life appeared ordinary, even admirable. But behind closed doors, a much darker story was unfolding. On a seemingly normal night, Colin Griffith made a call to 911. His voice was calm, unsettlingly so. He claimed his mother had fallen on a knife. But as authorities soon discovered, this was no accident, it was a crime scene drenched in horror. What made this case even more chilling was that this wasn't the first time Colin had been involved in a deadly act of violence. Just 1 year earlier, his father had also died at his hands. Authorities had ruled it as self-defense. But was it really? Now, with a second brutal death in the family, the question becomes impossible to ignore. Could it truly be coincidence? Or was something far more sinister at play? Tonight, we unravel the disturbing case of Colin Griffith, a case so shocking that even the most experienced investigators were left speechless. The night of September 8, 2024, was supposed to be like any other in Polk County, Florida. The air was thick with humidity, the distant sound of crickets filling the quiet suburban streets. Neighbors had just settled in for the night, unaware that behind the walls of one unassuming home, an unspeakable horror had just unfolded. At exactly 9:47 p.m., the local 911 dispatch center received a call. The operator answered, expecting the usual distress, the usual panic that came with emergencies. But what they heard was something else entirely. The voice on the other end was eerily calm. Emotionless. "We had a long fight, she fell on a knife. She's bleeding from the neck." For a moment, there was silence. The operator hesitated, as if processing what had just been said. The words didn't match the tone. There was no urgency. No frantic screaming. No desperate plea for help. Just a cold, mechanical statement. The caller was 17-year-old Colin Griffith. "Who's bleeding?" the operator finally asked. "My mom," Colin replied, his voice as steady as if he were discussing the weather. The dispatcher pressed for more details, but Colin offered little. No explanation of how she had fallen, no attempt to express concern for her well-being. Just that same chilling indifference. Emergency responders were dispatched immediately, sirens piercing through the quiet Florida night. Within minutes, squad cars and ambulances pulled up to the Griffith residence. But before they could even reach the door, Colin was already outside. He stood still in the dim glow of the porch light, waiting for them. His hands were stained with blood. His clothes soaked. Yet his face remained unreadable, blank, devoid of any visible emotion. No tears. No panic. No fear. An officer approached cautiously, expecting a frightened teenager, perhaps in shock. But what he got was something far more unsettling. "What happened?" the officer asked. Colin didn't fumble for words. He didn't even hesitate. Instead, he simply said, "I know my rights. I want an attorney." The officers exchanged glances. The way he said it was rehearsed. Not the words of a panicked son who had just lost his mother, but the words of someone who had already prepared for this moment. Something was very, very wrong. Leaving Colin in the hands of another officer, investigators stepped inside the house. And what they found sent shivers down their spines. The living room, once an ordinary family space, was now a scene of horror. Blood pooled across the hardwood floor, seeping into the cracks, darkening the once warm tones of the wood. In the center of it all lay Kathy Griffith's lifeless body. A single, deep wound cut through her throat. The weapon, a 12-inch kitchen knife, lay inches away, its blade slick with blood. At first glance, there were no obvious signs of struggle. No overturned furniture. No broken glass. No defensive wounds on Kathy's hands. She hadn't fought back. This wasn't a desperate, chaotic struggle. This was something else. Something colder. More calculated. And then there was the biggest problem of all, Colin's explanation. She fell on a knife. It was absurd. The force required for such a wound wasn't something that could happen by accident. The angle, the depth, it all pointed to a deliberate act. A targeted strike. It was murder. And as officers processed the grisly scene before them, they realized something even more disturbing. This wasn't Colin Griffith's first time standing over a dead parent. Just 1 year earlier, in a different state, Colin had killed before. And the deeper investigators dug, the more they realized, this tragedy had been brewing for a long time. 1 year before Kathy Griffith's brutal murder, another life had been taken, Colin Griffith's father, Charles Griffith. But unlike Kathy's case, this death didn't immediately raise suspicions. It happened in February 2023, in Lincoln County, Oklahoma. A quiet, rural area where neighbors knew each other by name and violent crime was rare. On that night, Colin was just 16 years old. A minor. A teenager. A boy who, up until then, had no known history of serious criminal activity. But that all changed with one gunshot. The emergency call came in at 10:32 p.m. A young male voice, breathless and shaken, told the dispatcher, "My dad tried to kill me. I had no choice." Deputies arrived at the scene to find Charles Griffith dead in his home, a single bullet wound to the chest. The weapon, a .40 caliber handgun, was found nearby. And standing over his father's body was Colin, the only person in the house at the time of the shooting. Blood splattered across the carpet. The lingering scent of gunpowder still hung in the air. Colin's version of events was clear. His father had attacked him with a knife. He had no choice but to shoot in self-defense. And at first, the evidence seemed to support his claim. There was a knife found at the scene, close to Charles's body. And Charles had a history of domestic violence, including a prior arrest for assault. So when Colin told detectives that his father had lunged at him with a weapon, investigators didn't immediately doubt him. The case was filed as justifiable homicide, a tragic but legally defensible act of self-preservation. No charges were filed. Colin was free. But what no one knew at the time, what no one could have predicted, was that this was just the beginning. Even though the case had been ruled as self-defense, something about it never sat right with those who knew Charles Griffith. Yes, he had a history of violence. Yes, he had been known to have a temper. But those close to him found it hard to believe he would have actually tried to kill Colin. Something felt off. Some family members began whispering among themselves, questioning what had really happened that night. Had Charles truly attacked first? Or had Colin been the aggressor? The medical examiner's report only fueled the doubts. Charles had been shot in the chest but from a distance. If he had been lunging at Colin with a knife, how did Colin manage to fire a precise shot without any defensive wounds of his own? And then there was Colin's demeanor. At 16 years old, most kids would have been traumatized after taking another person's life, especially their own father. But Colin? He was calm. Almost too calm. When officers questioned him, there were no tears. No shaking hands. No visible remorse. Just cold, logical explanations. One investigator, who later spoke anonymously, recalled the chilling moment when they asked Colin how he felt about what had happened. His answer? "I did what I had to do." Despite the quiet doubts among some investigators, the case was closed. Colin avoided prosecution and was given a fresh start. After his father's death, he moved to Florida to live with his mother, Kathy. To the outside world, it seemed like a chance to rebuild, to leave the trauma behind. But in reality, Colin's past wasn't staying in the past. It was only growing darker. And just 1 year later, another parent would be dead. Only this time, there would be no self-defense claim that could save him. After the death of his father, Colin Griffith was given a second chance, a fresh start in Florida with his mother, Kathy Griffith. To the outside world, it seemed like the right move. A change of scenery. A chance for a troubled teenager to heal. But those who knew Colin best knew the truth. There was something deeply wrong with him. And the signs were there. The problem wasn't just that Colin had killed before. It was how easily he had moved on. For a 16-year-old boy, taking the life of a parent should have been a traumatic experience. A normal teenager, especially one who had acted in true self-defense, would have struggled with guilt, grief, or even PTSD. But Colin showed none of it. He never talked about his father's death, not in the way you'd expect from a grieving son. He didn't dwell on it. He didn't seem haunted by what he had done. If anything, he seemed more comfortable in his new life. And then, just a few months later, the warning signs began. By September 2023, Colin's behavior had spiraled out of control. His mother, desperate for help, had him placed under Florida's Baker Act, a law that allows authorities to detain individuals for a mental health evaluation if they are considered a danger to themselves or others. This wasn't something Kathy did lightly. She feared her son. And her fears were justified. During one of his psychiatric evaluations, Colin reportedly made a chilling statement. "I'll kill myself, or I'll kill my mother." It was a direct threat. A clear sign that something was terribly wrong. Yet despite this, Colin was released. Psychiatrists determined that he did not meet the criteria for long-term hospitalization. They sent him back home, back to the very person he had threatened to kill. And Kathy, for all her love and patience, was now living with a ticking time bomb. Just 2 months after his release, Colin's anger reached a terrifying new level. In November 2023, Kathy called 911. Her son had attacked her. The reason? She had taken away his video games. What should have been a minor argument between a mother and son turned into a brutal assault. According to reports, Colin shoved Kathy to the ground and stomped on her. Not just once. Multiple times. When officers arrived, they were stunned by the sheer rage and physical force Colin had used against his own mother. And yet once again Colin was not arrested. Instead, he claimed self-defense. Self-defense, against his own mother, a woman who had only wanted to discipline her son. The police, unsure of how to proceed, let him go. And Kathy? She didn't press charges. She still believed she could help him. That Colin was just a troubled teenager. That this wasn't who he really was. But deep down, she must have known if he had already attacked her once, it would only be a matter of time before he did it again. Despite everything, Kathy never gave up on Colin. She still celebrated his achievements on social media. She posted photos of him smiling at his early high school graduation. She even bought him a car, a gift to mark the milestone. From the outside, it looked like a mother and son rebuilding their lives. But behind the scenes, the cracks were showing. By February 2024, Colin's behavior had become so unpredictable that he ran away from home after another explosive argument. He showed up at his grandmother's house in Polk County, Florida, looking for a place to stay. But his grandmother refused to take him in. She had already seen what Colin was capable of. She knew that if she let him stay, she might be next. And then came the chilling statement that would later haunt everyone who had heard it. When asked why he didn't want to go back home, Colin allegedly said, "I'll use any force necessary to avoid it, including killing my mother." It was a direct admission of intent. And yet just 2 weeks later, he was back in her home. Kathy took him in again, hoping things would get better. But they never did. The violence, the threats, the growing rage inside him, it was all leading to something inevitable. And by September 8, 2024, Kathy Griffith would be dead. Kathy Griffith had every reason to be afraid of her son. She had seen his violent outbursts firsthand. She had heard him say he would kill her. She had watched him spiral deeper into darkness, from his father's death, to his psychiatric evaluation, to his terrifying attack over something as trivial as video games. And yet she still believed in him. Because despite everything, Kathy was a mother first. And a mother's love is not so easily broken. By early 2024, Colin Griffith had burned nearly every bridge in his life. His grandmother, too afraid of what he might do, had refused to let him stay in her home. His mental health professionals had already flagged him as a risk, yet still, he had been released. And now, even Colin himself was saying the words no one wanted to hear. "I'll use any force necessary to avoid going back home, including killing my mother." But where else could he go? At just 17 years old, Colin had no job, no real friends, and no means of supporting himself. His mother's house was his only option. So, after just 2 weeks of running away, Colin did what he always did. He went back. And Kathy? She took him in. Once again, she chose to believe that her son could be saved. That the love of a mother was stronger than whatever demons lurked inside him. But this time, it was different. This time, she was running out of hope. If Kathy was still holding on to hope, it was slipping through her fingers. By May, she was doing something no mother should ever have to do. She was documenting her son's behavior, as if trying to prepare for the inevitable. She had told friends and family that Colin was getting worse. That she was afraid of him. But at the same time, she kept up appearances. She still posted smiling photos on social media, proudly showing off Colin's early high school graduation. She even bought him a car, a final act of love, as if trying to anchor him to something good. From the outside, it looked like a fresh start. But behind closed doors, Kathy knew the truth. And so did Colin. As summer approached, the tension inside the Griffith household reached a boiling point. Colin had nowhere to direct his anger except at the one person who had never abandoned him. He isolated himself, spending long hours alone. He avoided family gatherings, refusing to speak to anyone. He grew resentful of his mother, blaming her for everything wrong in his life. And then the threats started again. It was no longer just a passing statement in a psychiatric facility. Colin was openly hostile. He no longer hid the fact that he hated his mother. And Kathy knew it. By August 2024, those closest to Kathy said she had changed. She was more cautious, as if walking on eggshells. She chose her words carefully around Colin. She stopped arguing with him. But none of it mattered. Because Colin had already made up his mind. 2 days before Kathy's murder, Colin finally snapped. After one last explosive argument, he ran away again, but this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't coming back voluntarily. He went to his grandmother's house, demanding a place to stay. But once again she refused. Colin was furious. He had nowhere to go. No control over his own life. And no way to escape his mother. So he made a choice. A choice that would change everything. Kathy Griffith didn't want to give up on her son. She drove to her mother's house, determined to bring Colin home one last time. She didn't know that she was walking into a trap. Neighbors later recalled a horrifying scene: Colin, waiting outside, his face cold and expressionless. And then, he grabbed his mother by the hair. Dragged her inside the house. Her screams filled the neighborhood. "Let me go, Colin." But no one came. No one could save her. And 2 hours later, Kathy Griffith was dead. When police arrived, Colin was waiting outside. Just like before. Just like with his father. His clothes were stained with blood. But his face was blank. No remorse. No panic. And when asked what happened inside the house, he said only one thing. "I know my rights. I want an attorney." Just like that, it was over. The boy who had once claimed self-defense, who had once convinced authorities that he was just a victim, had finally shown his true colors. This time, there would be no excuses. This time, there would be no second chances. Because this time, everyone knew the truth. Kathy Griffith never stopped loving her son. Even when he hurt her. Even when he scared her. Even when he threatened her life. She still believed he could be saved. She still believed that somewhere inside, he was still the little boy she had raised. But Colin was no longer that little boy. He was something else entirely. And in the end, her love wasn't enough to save him. Instead, it cost her everything. On the morning of September 8, 2024, Kathy Griffith woke up with a mission, to bring her son home. Colin had been gone for 2 days, refusing to return after their last fight. But Kathy refused to let him drift away. She had spent the last 17 years trying to save him. And she wasn't about to stop now. So, she got into her car and began the 35-minute drive to her mother's house in Polk County, Florida, where Colin was staying. She had no idea that this would be the last drive of her life. As Kathy pulled into the driveway, she had no reason to be afraid. Colin was standing outside, waiting. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't throwing a tantrum. He was just watching her. To Kathy, this was a good sign. Maybe he had finally calmed down. Maybe they could talk. Maybe this time, things would be different. But Kathy didn't know what the neighbors had already seen. She didn't know that Colin had spent the last 2 days stewing in his anger. She didn't know that he had already told people that he would do anything to avoid going back home. And she definitely didn't know that as she stepped out of the car, Colin was already planning her death. The moment Kathy walked toward him, Colin snapped. There was no argument. No warning. No chance for her to escape. He lunged. He grabbed his mother by the hair, twisting her head backward with brutal force. "Let me go, Colin." Her screams shattered the quiet neighborhood. But no one came to help. No one knew what was happening behind those doors. With terrifying strength, Colin dragged his mother inside the house. The door slammed shut. And then silence. For the next 2 hours, Kathy fought for her life. But she never had a chance. Because Colin had already made up his mind. Investigators later pieced together what happened inside the house. And the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. Blood splatter analysis suggested that Kathy was first thrown to the ground, possibly striking her head against the floor. From there, Colin stood over her. There were bruises on her arms and shoulders, indicating a struggle as if Kathy had tried to fight him off. But Colin was younger. Stronger. And he wasn't holding back. At some point, he grabbed a large 12-inch kitchen knife. And then he struck. The knife sliced through Kathy's throat in a single, brutal motion. A deep, clean wound. The blade cut straight through vital arteries, ensuring a rapid, almost immediate death. Forensic experts later confirmed. There was no hesitation. No signs of panic. No second guesses. Whoever killed Kathy Griffith did it with precision. After Kathy collapsed, the house was silent. Colin didn't scream. He didn't cry. He didn't even bother to check if his mother was still alive. Instead, he simply stood over her body, watching as her blood pooled onto the floor. Then, as if nothing had happened, He washed his hands, changed his clothes, and calmly called 911. His voice was eerily flat when the dispatcher answered. "We had a long fight, she fell on a knife. She's bleeding from the neck." There was no urgency. No desperation. Just cold, emotionless words as if he were reading a script. By the time officers arrived, Colin was waiting outside the house. His new clothes were clean, but forensic testing later found tiny traces of blood beneath his fingernails. When police asked him what happened inside, Colin didn't try to defend himself. He simply said, "I know my rights. I want an attorney." Just like that, it was over. Inside the house, investigators found a horror scene. Kathy's body lay on the kitchen floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. The murder weapon, a 12-inch knife, was still at the scene. There were no signs of forced entry. No evidence that anyone else had been there. The only fingerprints on the knife? Colin's. But the most chilling detail? There were no signs of hesitation wounds on Kathy's body. This wasn't a struggle gone wrong. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was a deliberate, controlled execution. And Colin was the only one who could have done it. Colin's story was simple but impossible to believe. She fell on a knife. That was his entire defense. But the forensic evidence told a very different story. Experts confirmed. The angle of the wound was too precise to be an accident. The depth of the stab indicated forceful penetration, not a simple fall. Blood spray patterns showed that Kathy had been standing before she collapsed, which meant she hadn't fallen onto anything. In other words, Colin was lying. And this time, no one believed him. 17 years old. 2 dead parents. 2 eerily similar crime scenes. 2 claims of self-defense. But this time, Colin wasn't getting away with it. Sheriff Grady Judd didn't mince words when he addressed the press. "When you look at him, you see a kid. When I look at him, I see a psychopath." But was Colin truly a psychopath? Or was there something even darker lurking beneath the surface? That's the question experts are still trying to answer. When the news broke, people struggled to process the horror. The boy in the mugshot didn't look like a monster. He didn't have the wild, unhinged stare of a madman. He wasn't covered in tattoos or dressed in all black. He looked like any other 17-year-old kid, someone you might pass in the hallways at school, someone you might sit next to in class. But behind that blank expression, behind those cold, empty eyes, lurked something truly terrifying. Because Colin Griffith wasn't just any teenager. He was a boy who had killed both of his parents before turning 18. And now, the world was asking the same question. Was he born evil? Or was he made this way? Sheriff Grady Judd was convinced. To him, this wasn't a case of mental illness. It wasn't about a troubled boy who lost control. It was about a cold-blooded killer, a psychopath who had manipulated the system and gotten away with murder once before. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He didn't show an ounce of remorse. That's not normal. That's not human. According to criminal psychologists, Colin fit many of the classic traits of a psychopath. Lack of empathy, he showed no emotion after killing his mother. Superficial charm, teachers and classmates never suspected a thing. Manipulativeness, he convinced authorities his father's death was self-defense. Impulsivity and aggression, the domestic violence incidents, the violent threats, the murder itself. One thing was clear. This wasn't a normal teenager with anger issues. This was something much darker. But not everyone agreed with the psychopathy theory. Other experts believed there was more to the story. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Bohr argued that labeling Colin as a psychopath was too easy. We often look at killers and say, they're evil, they're broken, they're monsters. But human behavior is more complex than that. According to Dr. Bohr, Colin may have been suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness, one that had been ignored for far too long. His violent outbursts, his lack of emotional regulation, his previous hospitalization under the Baker Act, these weren't just random acts of aggression. They could have been symptoms. But symptoms of what? Some experts pointed to borderline personality disorder, BPD, a condition known for explosive anger, extreme mood swings, and intense fear of abandonment. Others suggested conduct disorder, a diagnosis often given to children who exhibit violent behavior at a young age and one that can eventually lead to antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for psychopathy. But the scariest possibility? Colin might not have been mentally ill at all. Because not all killers are broken. Some are just born that way. Regardless of whether Colin was mentally ill or a remorseless killer, one thing was clear. The warning signs were there. And no one stopped him. Think about it. He had already killed his father and was let go. He had physically attacked his mother before and was still allowed back into her home. He had threatened to kill himself or his mother and was released from a psychiatric hold. At every stage, the system had a chance to intervene. And at every stage, it failed. Kathy Griffith tried to protect her son. She called 911. She sought mental health treatment for him. She tried to keep her family together. But in the end, her love couldn't save him. And it cost her everything. This is the question that haunts everyone involved. If Colin had been convicted for his father's murder, would Kathy still be alive? If he had been kept in psychiatric care, would he have gotten the help he needed? If someone had listened to the warning signs, could this have been stopped? We may never know the answers. But we do know this. Kathy Griffith should still be alive today. And Colin Griffith should have never been given the chance to kill again. When the news broke about Colin Griffith's arrest, it sent shockwaves through Florida and beyond. The idea that a 17-year-old had not only killed his father but had now murdered his mother in cold blood was almost too horrifying to comprehend. How could this happen? How could a boy kill the two people who loved him the most? For those who had known Kathy Griffith, the tragedy was unbearable. She had been a dedicated mother, a hard-working woman, and someone who truly believed in second chances. She had spent months fighting for her son, believing that he could be saved, believing that somewhere inside of him was still the little boy she had raised. But in the end, her love wasn't enough to stop him. Now, her family, her friends, and even strangers following the case wanted only one thing: justice. Prosecutors wasted no time. Colin Griffith was quickly charged with first-degree murder, as well as kidnapping and violating a no-contact order. Under Florida law, a 17-year-old charged with first-degree murder can be prosecuted as an adult. And in Colin's case, that's exactly what the state wanted. They weren't going to make the same mistake twice. He had already gotten away with one killing. They weren't about to let him walk free again. From the moment he was arrested, Colin refused to show any emotion. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He didn't even ask about his mother. When interrogated, he didn't try to defend himself. He simply repeated one chilling phrase. "I know my rights. I want an attorney." To investigators, it was just further proof that Colin was not like other teenagers. He didn't act like a scared kid who made a terrible mistake. He acted like someone who had done this before. And of course, he had. But this time, there was no escaping justice. Unlike with his father's death, where Colin had claimed self-defense, this time the evidence was undeniable. Witnesses heard Kathy screaming for help as Colin dragged her into the house. The medical examiner confirmed that her injuries were not consistent with an accident. Colin had made multiple threats in the past, including saying he would kill his mother. He had already been violent toward her before and had even been hospitalized for it. There was no excuse this time. No self-defense story. No reasonable doubt. Colin Griffith was going to prison. Since Colin was a minor at the time of the crime, he could not legally face the death penalty. But that didn't stop some members of the public from demanding it. People were furious. They saw Colin as a remorseless killer, someone who had manipulated the system once before and someone who would kill again if given the chance. But the law was clear. The maximum sentence Colin Griffith could receive was life in prison. Still, for Kathy's loved ones, that was enough. Because no matter what happened next, one thing was certain. Colin Griffith would never be free again. This case is not just about a brutal murder. It's about a system that ignored the warning signs. Think about it. Colin had already killed before. He had attacked his mother before. He had been hospitalized for violent tendencies. He had made direct threats to kill his mother. And yet he was still free. How many times did authorities have a chance to intervene? How many times could this have been prevented? And the most haunting question of all: how many more Colin Griffiths are out there waiting for their moment? Kathy Griffith tried everything. She called the police. She put him in therapy. She begged for help. But in the end, no one could save her from her own son. Some people blame the legal system. Why was he let go after his father's murder? Why wasn't he kept in psychiatric care? Others blame mental health professionals. Why wasn't he properly diagnosed? Why was he released from the Baker Act when he was clearly a danger to himself and others? And some blame Kathy herself. Why did she let him back into her home? Why didn't she leave? But the truth is there are no easy answers. Because at the end of the day, Kathy Griffith did what any mother would do. She believed in her son. She believed he could change. She believed that love was enough. And in the end, that belief cost her everything. This case serves as a chilling warning. When someone shows you who they are, believe them. Kathy wanted to believe in her son. She wanted to believe he was still the little boy she had raised. But the truth was much darker. He had already killed before. And he would do it again. If there's one lesson to be learned from this story, it's this. Love cannot fix evil. And sometimes, the people we love the most are the ones we should fear the most. Stay safe. And remember, sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones closest to us.